Kia ora everyone, welcome back. Yesterday I talked about writing for research and how writing is a learned skill. Today I want to talk about writing as an iterative process. I read a quote from a writer that said, a professional writer is an amateur who didn't quit. And I think this writing as an iterative process is how we learn that learned skill of writing. One of the biggest mistakes that PhD students and postgraduate students make is thinking that writing their thesis or writing their paper is going to be like writing an undergraduate research essay or a blog post. They'll sit down with a relatively clear idea of what the question is and a relatively clear idea of what the answer is, then proceed to write until both those ideas have been expressed. They'll then submit their thesis, their huge thesis, and receive a grade for their efforts. But two things will strike you as you get into your postgraduate journey. Firstly, you generally only have a really vague idea of what the question is. And the question in your research is what you actually develop, partly through the writing process. Secondly, you usually have a lot of chance to get feedback on your work before you submit it. And if you're a thesis student, it's definitely expected. In effect, this means that at the very least, your writing should go through 2 iterations. However, at the PhD and the master's level, and if you're writing for publication, there will be many more iterations. Even once you have submitted for publication, reviewers and editors will make suggestions and critique your work, help you fine-tune your piece before it's distributed more widely. What I would like to suggest is that we approach every piece of writing as an iterative process, and that we plan the time to write and rewrite. The time for writing your first draft is really about working out what you want to say. My post on writing spew drafts on the blog covers some great strategies for this. But most of these strategies can really be summed up in 2 quotes from 2 writers. Ernest Hemingway famously said, write drunk, edit sober. And along the same lines, but perhaps less alcoholic, Stephen King says, write the first draft with the door closed and rewrite the second draft with the door open. What do they mean by that? I'm not sure that literally writing drunk for your first draft might be the best thing, but the idea is to write without inhibition, for the first draft at least. Then sobering up, putting on your sober self to edit out some of the less compelling parts of that piece. And Stephen King's metaphor is even better, writing that first draft with the door closed, with no expectation that anyone else will be looking at it. It's for you to work out what you're saying. But when you come around to rewriting, you write with the door open. That is, inviting the reader in, thinking about how the reader might respond to what you're writing. How can you make it clearer and easier for the reader to understand? What kind of context are they coming from, and how might you edit to recognize that? When I was a PhD student, a colleague of mine gave me a set of questions to consider when writing up an article or a chapter. And I've lost that set of questions, and I can't really recall the person who drafted them, so I haven't been able to find them. But I do remember that one of the things you had to do was name 5 people that you hoped would read your article. And I still do this when I set out to write or revise an article, or when I'm supervising a PhD student. So we'll actually look up 5 people that we think would like to read it and keep them in mind, not so much when we're writing, but when we're editing. So if you're writing a thesis, these 5 people might be your supervisors, your examiners, but also a few people you'd like to read it because they have similar interest areas, even if they're unlikely to ever get access to it. But name them. You could put them on a post-it note above your computer as you're writing or as you're editing. Then revise your work with those people's knowledge set in mind. So an example of this is when I was writing my PhD thesis, which was 10 years ago now. I had an idea of 3 people who would be most likely asked to examine it. So when I was editing, I went through and thought about what they knew about my topic and what their responses were likely to be. So one examiner had a really strong grounding in feminist and geographic theory, but wasn't likely to know much about China, which is where my fieldwork was located. And another examiner had a really strong grounding in anthropology and was a Chinese person who researched in China, but was unlikely to have much knowledge about the Australian and New Zealand component of my fieldwork, or the feminist and geographic framing for that matter. So when I was editing, I went through each sentence and tried to think about what those examiners would know. I edited the sentences, I added footnotes, I connected to the literature that they had cited in their work and cited them as well. It's part of being a good conversationalist when you're writing. But Stephen King's door advice is not just useful for editing, it's also useful to remember if you're facing any form of paralysis in your writing. I would argue that if you write your first draft with the door open, it can lead to writer's block or paralysis. So PhD coach Alison Miller, she changes the metaphor a bit and likens it to having too many programs open on your old Windows PC. And I haven't experienced this for many years, but in the old days, if you had too many programs open, your PC would freeze and you'd have to restart it. And her idea was that if you are having all of these, maybe the equivalent is having too many tabs open, distracting you. If you've got your grammatically correct mother-in-law, your supervisor, your examiner, the other PhD student, a really critical reviewer that you had once, if all of those people are in your head as you're trying to write, it can cause you to completely freeze and be paralyzed. So if you are writing but just concentrating on what you want to say, you might be able to stumble through an entire draft and get to the end of it eventually. But if you're writing and thinking about what your supervisor thinks, your examiner thinks, or that grammar police person thinks, or even what your PhD writing group thinks, you might just freeze up and be unable to progress your draft and then engage in other kinds of procrastinating activities like watching Netflix or recording vlogs, for example. So I discuss this a little in my blog, particularly in the post on writing spew drafts, which are for you and for you alone. They're not for anyone else to see. And in that piece, I also outlined some ways of thinking about the iterative process of writing using different hats that you might need to put on, including crazy person, architect, engineer, and cleaner in your writing. So check that out. But the point is, at some stage, the door does have to open. And that includes rewriting with the reader in mind. And eventually, it's also necessary to get some actual feedback from real people, whether it's from a supervisor, a colleague, a reviewer, an editor. Feedback is essential for even the best writers. And if you don't have any people to ask, why not start a writing group? It can even be a virtual writing group. Connect with some people on Twitter or in your department that might need some help with their writing. So that way you can exchange work and get feedback on the experience of others reading your writing. And they don't necessarily even have to be in your discipline, because sometimes that really helps you clarify and explain the way that you are approaching something. I think when asking for feedback, you need to be really clear about what kind of feedback you're looking for. If you don't want proofreading because it's in an early stage of ideas, be really clear with your reader what you're actually looking for. For example, you can say, what do you think my main argument is, and is it coming through clearly? And you can check out some other posts in my blog for key ideas about getting feedback on your writing. Ka kite.